Well, in the last few minutes, I've been speaking with Professor, Jibrin Ibrahim. And if you are interested in reading about his life, there's a book have on the screen. I'll leave the address of the publishers in the description so that you can get a copy. Now, back to you, Prof. When you got to the school, what happened? You were coming from a Christian family, obviously a minority in Kano. And then you were going to a school that I presume then was predominantly a Muslim school.
I think the first issue is that I was born and grew up in Kano, but where I was born and where I grew up was Sabon Gari, Kano, which is essentially a Christian enclave in Kano city. So I grew up completely surrounded by Christian community. And my primary school, which was the St. Thomas Primary School, was actually essentially an Igbo school in terms of maybe 85 to 90% of the students were actually Igbo. So two things happened that were quite dramatic. The Civil War, the coup occurred in 1966. After the coup, there was Awari. You remember when there were these riots that broke out against southern communities in northern cities. And in Kano, that led to the major Awari night when soldiers joined these Awari attacks. And lots of members of the Igbo community were killed, and subsequently the others had to leave town. So these were all issues I witnessed live. When the soldiers came, they were shooting bullets into the rooms we were sleeping in, demanded for us to open the door. We opened the doors, and they were going from room to room looking for people they thought they had to kill. When I came out the next morning, a lot of my personal friends and school fees, I saw their dead bodies on the streets. And that was maybe, in a sense, one of the big trauma in my own personal life. Subsequently, I went to secondary school in Zaria. That was Barewa College. And Barewa College is a very interesting school in the history of northern Nigeria. It was a school where a lot of the leadership in the north had been trained. And it had for objective to be some sort of a unity school for northern Nigeria. And the intake each year was 3 or 4 students selected from every province in northern Nigeria and brought together in this school in Zaria. In that sense, therefore, it was a very cosmopolitan school with lots of Muslim and Christian students. And the whole approach of the school was to try to work towards unity between these students. I always talk about the book of prayers that we use every morning in assembly, which was a book specifically prepared by the government of northern Nigeria to promote religious understanding between Christians and Muslims. And the book of prayer had selected readings from the Bible, from the Quran, from the other religious texts that showed the belief of both Christians and Muslims were almost identical in most important issues. It was for me an important vista through which I could understand Islam and see Islam as a sister religion rather than an enemy religion. One of the things that has really hurt me over the years growing up, in the way in which religious education has changed so dramatically, and the religions see the other as the enemy religion rather than the sister religion. I think one of the important things Nigeria could do is to bring together theologians to update that book that emphasized similarities between our religions as a pathway to mending some of the religious fractures that have emerged in our society and have created so much havoc, so much insecurity, and above all, so much misunderstanding. I think that's a pathway that could be very useful if we were to adopt it today.
So since 1966 or thereabout, you have been caught in this web that appears to be increasing. That conflict has not really reduced. The divisions appear to be widening. Would that be your opinion?
Well, definitely. I think the Aware Araba phenomenon was a very profound fracture in the evolution of the Nigerian state because it created a sense of personal insecurity among Nigerians and brought the notion of the other being conceived as the enemy. I think what really happened was that there was a real attempt by the then Gawan administration to address this issue. And at the end of the Civil War, the dictum of no victor, no vanquished was proposed by Gawan as a way out. And he placed on the table the question of reconciliation. I think those attempts did go some way in reassuring people and bringing some semblance of unity by the time the war ended in 1970. And those who were in Biafra came back to the rest of the country and resumed their businesses and lives in other parts of the country. So that was the situation as of 1970. But what happened was that the 1970s was also a time of serious religious transformation at the world level. You recall the Iranian Revolution emerged, political Islam emerged, and large-scale global mobilization along religious lines emerged all over the world. And what those processes did was to revive the fractures that had emerged in Nigeria at the end of the 1960s and solidify them into structures of conflict. And that was the context in which religious mobilization, what came to be known as the manipulation of religion in Nigeria, became a key problem in terms of our politics. And what happened then was that the political system became embroiled in religious controversy. You recall that when the process of writing the 1979 Constitution was extremely problematic because Christians were actively mobilizing that the Constitution should specifically state that the Nigeria has a secular state, while Muslim mobilizers were making the argument that secularity was a term that was integral to Christianity and Western states and was not acceptable in Islam. That debate could not be resolved by the political class. Ultimately, Olusegun Obasanjo had to intervene and take the decision that, okay, the way out is we will not put secularity in the Constitution, but we'll put Article 10 of the Constitution, which says that there shall not be a state religion in Nigeria. So that was a compromise worked out by General Obasanjo at that time, and that's still the situation with the Constitution. But because the debates out there had been very deep and active, that resolution, as it were, was not completely satisfactory to both sides of the debate. And when eventually we had the emergence of religious groups arming themselves and questioning and attacking the Nigerian state as well as neighbors, it became entrenched into this culture we now have of hate between the two communities. And if today Nigeria is confronted with the significant concerns by Christian communities of what has been called Christian genocide in Nigeria, it's all part of this long history of differences that have become politicized, that have become instruments of mobilization, and have sucked the energy of different Nigerians from different religious backgrounds. It's an extremely complex issue and it's difficult to explain the narrative in a short interview. But I think it's something we need to continue to reflect and work on in terms of the search for a solution.
There appears to be an increasing thought in Europe today that multiculturalism is not about to succeed. How does that fit into Nigeria? Is it possible to craft what everyone will feel comfortable inside?
Well, let's say what we know from sociology, that all societies are heterogeneous societies. They are multicultural societies. They are multilinguistic societies. That's the nature of most societies. I remember when we went into university, one of the interesting issues on the sociological table was that the most homogeneous society was Somalian society, because every Somali is considered to have been a child, a great child of Somali, and that they are all part of the same family. It is interesting that one of the first states to continue to completely shatter on the basis of internal sociological differences was Somali society, where clans that are really representing different cousins of the same family became a strong dividing line and started massacring each other. And since then, reconstituting the Somali state has become extremely difficult, and different states of the Somali have emerged in different countries and societies, and Somali itself has been split along strict political lines. So the fact of the matter, whether we like it or not, is that we all live in multicultural societies, and that therefore we need to learn to tolerate and to live peacefully with each other. There is no society in the world that is simply homogeneous without any sociological fractures within it. Even if such a society exists, you can clearly create those fractures. You remember in this country where Sokoto State, old Sokoto State, Northwest State, was considered a homogeneous society of the Sokotawa people. When the night Kebbi and Zamfara states were created, there were riots on the streets that these tourists from Zamfara, Kebbi, must immediately leave their beloved Sokoto state. And by the next day, the Zamfarawa and the Kabawa that used to identify themselves as Sokotawa were now having different identities. That's the nature of identities. They always have this tendency to fracture, to divide, and the process that leads to that fracture and division is usually politically created by elites who have other objectives that they are pursuing. So I do know at the international level, we are in this phase in international politics where right-wing forces, populist forces are emerging around the world saying down with multiculturalism. We want a pure nationalist state to be the sole component of our country. We went through that with Hitler. We went through that with the history of fascism. And very sadly, what we are in a phase in our international system where fascism is on its way back. And that's one of the tools fascism uses to get to power.
Yeah, to be fair to Europe, sir, you agree with me that it has done a lot, much more than other parts of the world in accepting people from that are of different cultures. But the problem that there appears to be emerging is the fear that the newcomers are not ready to assimilate. They are creating parallel communities and creating tension in those countries. Now, what if we had a system, the type of rule-based system that governs the international community, were it to be applied in any country where everybody has the same type of laws applied to him, would this not have solved the problem of people being afraid that, like the fear in the UK, that you have a two-tier legal system where judges actually do give penalties for people from Asia, Southeast Asia, less punishment in courts than European-born citizens that commit the same type of offenses?
I think there are specific issues like biases in the way in which judgments are given, and it works both ways, and usually it works against the other, those seen as different rather than the way you put it. But my response to your belief that people of different cultures migrate to Europe and refuse to integrate, it's not true. I've lived in France for 7 years, and there's a very large Arab Muslim community in France, most of whom have integrated perfectly into French society. There is a fringe within them that said it is not ready to integrate, but it's a tiny minority. Of course, there are differences. Majority of the French people will be Christians. Some of these people may be Muslims. They are not going to change their religion because they want to assimilate into that society. So we shouldn't have that expectation, because these are societies in which religious freedom is guaranteed and people can have any religion they want to belong to. So I can contest the assertion that they have refused to integrate. Go and live in those societies and you'll see that most of them are actually integrating. The question of migration is a much larger question. What has been happening in Europe has also been a demographic crisis. For a society to reproduce itself and maintain its population, the need to give birth to one people every year. That is what will maintain the population. Many European societies have a birth rate of between 1.3 and 1.5%. Therefore, they are not able to reproduce themselves, and the society is getting older, and therefore there is a crisis in terms of human resources. They therefore encourage migration. We do know in this country, Nigeria, that every year thousands of Nigerians are recruited and given jobs in the UK, especially in social care work and in the medical field, because they desperately need people to come. Now, the poor in these societies see people coming and then they become an easy target of somebody to blame. And they start complaining, we are not getting jobs because these bloody Nigerians are coming and taking our jobs. But the issue is, these are people who are not trained to do these jobs, for example, or who are unwilling to do these jobs. So if there's migration to Europe, it's because there is a need felt by European societies for that migration. Now, given the way in which there's a lot of mobilization against foreigners, against the other in Europe, these contradictions arise, and then these migrants get blamed for every evil in society. That's the current dynamics we're witnessing. But the fact of the matter is that if people stop migrating to the UK, for example, that society is going to collapse in the next 5 years because they desperately need people in to come and fill in for the significant percentage of the population that's over 60 years old and is getting out of the workspace, and they don't have enough hands to do the work.
Let me come back to Nigeria. If you look at the system that we've had and your experience, your history, and how you have come, what will you suggest we do to change our story? I'm asking this question in the context of the fact that our indices, the indices, are not improving, they are deteriorating. Is there anything wrong with us that we are not getting it right? Because like I did joke the other day, we complain about slavery, slave trade, and the rest of them. If you bring a ship to the seaport and tell Nigerians to bribe so that they will get in to go and become slaves in other countries, you will see that Nigerians are going to bribe to get in there because the understanding is that things are not improving in this country.
Well, I think the way I read the situation is that, as I've said earlier, the quality of leadership in Nigeria has been declining over the decades. And the outcome has been more and more corrupt and crookish individuals have been occupying positions of power. And they use these positions of power essentially to raid the national treasury and the state treasury to take resources that are meant for the development of society for their own personal aggrandizement. That is why in this country, the level of poverty, the percentage of the population living in absolute poverty, has been growing regularly for the past 30 years. And each year, there are more poor people as a proportion of the population than the previous year. It's completely unacceptable that this is a country with enormous resources, with energy, with young people, and you have successive leaderships that are unable to mobilize the resources and the people of this country to produce so that we can reduce the level of poverty in our society. Over the past 30 years, China and India were able to engage on the path of development by first significantly reducing the percentage of the population living in absolute poverty, by spreading education and ensuring that the majority of people in the countries have access to education and are therefore able to transform our lives. In 1973, Nigeria made a national pledge that every child born as of the end of the Civil War, that's from 1970, would have access to qualitative and universal primary education. And the implication of that decision was that by 1976, every Nigerian of primary school age would be in primary school. If we had maintained that system just for 10 or 20 years, we would have had a situation where every Nigerian born from that time on, from 1970, would be educated and would therefore be in a position to improve the quality of their lives and livelihoods. What happened? Governments at the three levels, federal, state, and local governments, refused to allocate sufficient resources to ensure that the universal primary education process succeeded. Subsequently, Nigeria said, oh, it's not just primary school that should be universal. It should be junior secondary school as well. So 9 years of education. Excellent decision. But that was not implemented. What was the outcome? In 1973, when that decision was taken, General Gawan, who was head of state, had explained that by educating every Nigerian, we'll make sure we wouldn't have another civil. When the civil war launched by Boko Haram came up in 2009, it was because there were 30 to 40 million Nigerians who did not have access to primary school and who were not educated. One was right in foreseeing that if we don't educate Nigerians, we'll get back to civil war. We failed to educate them and we went right back to civil war. And today we find ourselves in a situation where we have multiple civil wars raging simultaneously in very many parts of the country. That's a tragedy.
Well, this issue about education, you also made reference to it in your memos in one of the articles there. The university education you earlier complained or earlier stated has problems. It doesn't appear as if we're getting to the end of the tragedy of tertiary education in Nigeria, despite the fact that our doctors are still being recognized around the world. It doesn't seem as if we have done much, even with the emergence of private universities, which, of course, understandably are concentrated in certain parts of the country.
Well, I think when you read Article 18 of the Constitution, it states that public education, education is a public good. And the understanding of the Constitution is that the Nigerian government should commit itself to providing quality education, as it says, at the primary, secondary, and tertiary level. So access to education at all levels is a constitutional right in this country. It's, however, a right that's ignored by governments, that's not implemented by governments, and there are consequences for it. I've been very interested in what has happened with tertiary level education. And the first problem with tertiary education is when your primary education is weak and your secondary education is weak, there's no magic that can make your tertiary education strong because these students are moving from one level to the next. But the biggest problem that emerged in our education is the way in which the children of the elite took a different path from the children of the masses. When UPE started in 1976, what happened was that in the 1980s, the elite in this country started setting up private schools for their children. So the children of the masses go to public schools. The children of the elite go to fee-paying school. And there was a divide in terms of the quality at the two ends, with the children of the elite having relatively good education and those of the masses having relatively poor education. And it's quite a dramatic difference. When you go to a rural public school, a secondary school, you'll find that graduating students are barely literate. So there's a huge gap that has existed. And that gap followed up to the tertiary level. And that was why there was pressure for private universities to be set up in the country. But by that time, the Nigerian elite had grown more ambitious and was more interested in sending their children abroad for tertiary education rather than within the country. And when I reviewed a lot of the private universities a few years ago, I found that they were doing very poorly because they didn't have a critical mass of students to make their systems viable. Most private universities have very few students, and most students go to public universities. Although there are more private universities than public universities, the fact of the matter is that 90% of university students go to public universities. And that's why it's extremely important that the quality of public universities remains high. ASU has been engaged in a flagship struggle since the 1980s to maintain the quality of university education. And they've had relative success. Had ASU not existed as a force in our educational system, the quality of our public universities would have collapsed completely by now. They have not completely collapsed, although they have weakened considerably over the period. And we owe that to ASU. But I think as a society, we need to address this divide and make sure public primary schools, public secondary schools, and ultimately public universities are well resourced and well funded to provide quality education for all of our children.
Now, as we run off, there's a question I want to ask. It does appear that we are yet to see an end to the challenges that Nigeria is having. You did say that the society is corrupt, most society is corrupt, a fact which cannot be disputed. And leadership comes from the people. We are going to keep reproducing this corruption and these challenges that this country has. Is there a way out?
Well, the way out is you have to turn your statement upside down. You said leadership comes from the people. That's not true. The reality is, so far, leadership comes only from the elite, and the people are simply watching. The way forward is for the people to realize in a democracy, power ultimately flows from the people, and they are the ones who are the embodiment of national sovereignty. And that in that capacity, as the sovereign, they have a right to determine the type of leadership they have. We have not done the advocacy to get the people to understand that. So they haven't understood it, and they are therefore not exercising leadership. You and I, everybody else involved, engages more in that advocacy to sensitize the ordinary people of this country to understand that the repository of political power and to start exercising that political power, then a solution will be in sight.
Well, okay, we'll leave it there. In the last few minutes, we've been talking to Professor Jibo on a wide range of issues, including his life and the differences between the past and the present. Prof, thank you once again for giving us this opportunity to speak with you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.